I think we probably are at like the upper end of the spectrum in terms of how much time and effort we put into it compared to other podcasters. I mean, we release an episode every week. We have a newsletter. We have 9 books that we published with the podcast over the past year, and we've done events and workshops and conferences associated with those. So we put a lot into it. But, some people release on a less regular or less frequent schedule, or they might not do like the newsletter, the social media, all the kind of stuff that goes alongside it. So you can kind of make of it what you will.
Hi friends, this is Read and Write with Natasha podcast. My name is Natasha Tynes and I'm an author and a journalist. In this channel, I talk about the writing life, review books, and interview authors. Hope you enjoy the journey. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me today for another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. So today is the first time we have 2 authors. We have Landis Wade and Sarah Archer. So both of them actually co-host the award-winning podcast, the Charlotte Readers Podcast, in which they have conducted more than 500 author interviews. Wow. It's a bit intimidating to interview podcast hosts. But Landis Wade writes lighthearted legal thrillers and mysteries with a historical or a holiday touch. And he's a recovering trial lawyer. And he is the founder of the Charlotte Readers Podcast. Sarah Archer is the author of the novel The Plus One, and she co-hosts the podcast Charlotte Readers. So both of them co-wrote a murder mystery novella called Death by Podcasting, and it's about 2 podcasters threatened with murder. Wow, this is going to be a fun episode. So thank you for joining me today, and I'm so excited to have you. So the first thing is, why did you write this book, and why did you write it, both of you together? So the floor is yours.
Well, the book initially was Landis's idea. It started out as an idea you had about this story with 2 literary podcasters who find out that one of the author guests that they're planning to interview on their big year-end live finale event coming up the following week has plans to murder them, but they don't know which one, they don't know why. And initially we were thinking like, let's write this as a short story. And it kind of spun out into a novella because we were having a lot of fun with it and just coming up with characters that we liked. And I think that Landis had the idea initially to co-write, but we both were kind of intrigued by that. We've had co-authors on the show before, and it's interesting to see kind of their process and how it's different from authors just working solo. I have a screenwriting background in that world. For TV and film, it's also much more kind of collaborative in terms of how the writing process happens a lot of times. So it's something that I'm interested in. And yeah, we started it, like May or June, I think was kind of when we first started talking about it, and then got it done over the summer and just published it.
I think I caught Sarah off guard when I said, hey, let's write a book together. And first of all, thank you, Natasha, for having us on your podcast. It was great having you on Charlotte's podcast way back when with your novel, and it's nice to be in the shotgun seat sometimes and not the driver's seat when it comes to doing this. But to follow up on Sarah's answer to your question, we'd interviewed these authors who'd written books together, and we interviewed an author who had written like a 1-hour read and put it up on Amazon for like 99 cents. And I was intrigued by this idea of writing a shorter book, a shorter mystery, and also intrigued by the idea of doing it with someone else. And since Sarah and I worked closely together on the podcast and we kind of knew each other's work ethic, I just threw this idea out to her and I said, hey, why don't we give this a try? What's the worst that can happen? And she comes from more of a literary fiction background, but she does do screenwriting, and she's got some humor in her Plus One book. And I like to put humor in what I write as well. And so we thought, well, let's do something fun with podcasting. Let's just sort of suppose, and Natasha, you interview authors too. Suppose you find out that one of your authors is going to kill you in 3 days. What do you do? How do you figure it out? You have to use your wits and you have to use your skill set from writing mysteries yourself to kind of figure out, well, which one of these people would want to kill me, and why in the world would they want to kill me? I'm just going to ask them questions. I mean, they can't be that sensitive. So, it sort of got us intrigued about how do we make this interesting? How do we create a lot of suspects? And we wanted to poke fun at writers and poke fun at ourselves as writers. And so we pick on thriller writers and we pick on romance writers and poets and we make them suspects. And it was a fun thing to do. And we can talk more about the process and the discipline, but that's a kind of an initial answer to your question.
Yeah, it's fun. So how did you manage to co-write it together and keep the same guest voice and the feel? Like both, every author has their different style. So how did you manage? Because when I read it, I didn't feel that it was two authors. It felt for me as one author writing it. So how did you pull that off?
Well, I think that was sort of a process that happened almost in layers. Like I wrote some of the first chapters initially in the first draft. Landis wrote some of the first chapters initially. And so those initial drafts probably felt slightly more distinct in our different voices. Like, for instance, I tend to write more detailed on a first draft, and Landis tends to add more of that in subsequent drafts. But then we went back and forth and edited several rounds on the whole book. So we were both editing each other's work. And so I think by the time we were done, it was much more of a kind of meld. Whereas initially we were writing different parts that were more distinctive. But just through the editing process, going through each other's work, we kind of each had our hands on each chapter by the end of it.
Yeah, and we initially thought we would try this in Google Drive where you could see each other as you're writing, but that created too much pressure on me. I thought I need to be able to write something and clean it up a little bit before I send it to my co-writer to take a shot at it. And so we just started working in drafts, and we would label the draft, and whoever's working in it would finish their work on it, including perhaps editing some of what the other person already done, and we'll put that in track changes and drop notes in, and then send that back, and then it would come back as draft 2, and then it could go back as draft 3 and draft, so we were just kind of sending drafts back and forth and using the track changes and the notes. But before we got really serious about that, we did sit down after we'd written about 4 chapters together and sort of talked about kind of where we might want this to go. We didn't have a full conclusion to it, but we knew the suspects we wanted to create. We knew perhaps who might be the one who did it, but we ended up with the kind of person we thought might do it, but in a totally different place because we changed how they were going to get into the story from where we started. But that's just part of the writing process. You find your way along, and that we just sort of found our way along as we went. But I will say this, and Sarah kind of alluded to it, and she can probably add to this as well, but I felt it really helped the writing process to get a more completed draft before advanced readers saw it, to have this built-in editorial process with a co-writer. You felt motivated, right? You didn't want to let the other writer down, and so you wanted to get back to them with something decent. So, and then 2, you wanted to respond to their critiques and kind of use it and, accept them and maybe add something, and you wanted to give good feedback to them. And so by that process, it wasn't as if we sat alone in a room by ourselves, wrote something, and then gave it to an editor, right? We were editing each other's work as we went, so that by the time it did get to 4 or 5 beta readers, it was in a much better shape than it would have been. And I think if just one person was doing it and staying in their own head the whole time.
Yeah, I think that was also one of the big benefits of the co-writing process, because it allowed us to be pretty efficient too. Like I could be writing a section while Landis was reading and editing and vice versa. And so we were sort of doing double duty the whole time. And like Landis said, we were able to get to a more polished draft that it had already had two brains working on it and editing it and reading through before we got to the beta reader stage, and 2 people who were invested in it and were going to edit it closely before we got there.
So you just released it 2 days ago, like 3 days ago, the 14th, correct? And how was it doing? What was the reception to the book in terms of and how did you market it through your podcast? And how is the book doing so far?
Yeah, well, I think it's doing pretty well. It got up to about number 340 in a particular category on Amazon, and we had a number of people who, ordered it in advance, and then we had a nice little event at a local bookstore here in Charlotte, Parker Books, an independent bookstore. And we had a number of people show up, but not Tosh, as you know, it's like you never really know how a book's doing. For what we do know is that we've done an Instagram tour, and we really are getting good feedback from the people on the bloggers on the tour who are reading it, because it's a little something different than what they normally read. It's
it's fun.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of slaps. And we know we went over the top, right, with some things, with the names and some different.
With the names, yeah.
And some people are not going to like that, right? But that's okay, But we didn't want to forget who people are, because we got a lot of characters in there, and so that was fun to do that. And but so far the reviews we're getting back from those reviewers and are really positive, and people seem to have a good time with it.
Yeah, and I think it helps too that it's short. It's pretty lighthearted. It's very plot focused, so it's kind of pacey. It's a novella, so it's not like a long read. So I think people like having a little bit of a break from the heavier novels, which is fun to see.
Yeah, I was reading a historical fiction set in the Middle East, and it was like long and sad and depressing. And then when I was like, you know what? I'm going to read a fun book, and it was such a change of like pace, and it was so much fun after all the drama that I was reading.
Right.
But so it was fun. And so I noticed that you self-published, or I think you have your own publishing company. So when I looked at the publishers here, it says that Charlotte Readers Podcast. So is this the first book published by you, or how is the process working for you in terms of the publishing?
Yeah, so we put out 8 nonfiction books this past year through the podcast, and published them through Charlotte Readers Podcast. Those books come from interviews in the first 4 years, and I'm sure, Natasha, you're quoted in one or more of those books. But we took authors, what they said in those first 500 interviews, and we turned them into 8 different books that are topic related, such as Learning to Write is one book, Writing Process and Tools is a book, Storytelling, Inspiration, and Research is a book, and then we have Writing Techniques and Characters is a book. And a fun book is The Emotional Writing Journey, where all of our authors we talk to lament what it's like sometimes to be a writer and the travails you go through, but also the joy that comes with writing. And then we have a final book in that 8-book series, which is publishing and book marketing. And this is not our advice. This is basically what the authors have told us in response to our questions about these different things. We always ask the question, I may have asked it to you, what was, if you could tell your younger writing self something of value that, had you to known it when you started this thing called writing, would make you a better writer. And we got some very interesting answers in response to that question. So to answer your question, we have now published 9 books under Charlotte's Podcast. And this is the 9th book, The Death by Podcasting. We just thought it made sense to do that because we built a team that can help us get the books out with a cover designer, a book designer. And then we've kind of been, because we've got 3 co-hosts on the podcast, 2 of which are authors, one's a publicist. We've got sort of this built-in team of critics that we can criticize ourselves and edit our own work, and not be offended by it,
yeah. So now basically you have your own publishing house, right? Are you going to expand on it and accept submissions? Like, let's say, can I submit your novel to your publishing house, for example, or anyone who's listening or watching?
Hands are full. We got podcast to do. We got our own books to write, so it'll probably for now just be whatever we decide to self-publish, and we'll do that through there. Because running a publishing company, I don't know how to do it, but I can imagine that there is a whole lot of work that goes into that. And Natasha, from being a podcaster, there's a lot of work that goes into vetting submissions, gathering the materials, making sure you have what you have. So on the publishing side, there's the same thing. And if you were to open it up and say, we're now accepting submissions, I think our mailboxes would be flooded, right? Because people are always looking for places to submit their work to. Yeah.
So you've never considered a traditional publisher because it's a fun book. It's a fun story that, I'm sure it can be picked up by one of the big 4, I guess.
So Sarah is traditionally published with her book with Penguin, the +1.
Okay.
But she can probably tell you it's a much longer process. And if we had tried to do this, Sarah, what do you think? It'd have been 2 or 3 years before Death by Podcasting would have come out?
Yeah. I mean, that was my experience with my novel. I think from the time that I started querying agents to the time that it came out was about 2 years, I believe. So it's a much longer process for sure, and much more involved in some ways. Like with this, we finished writing it in like August, and it came out in November. So we were able to be very efficient with it. And a lot of that was because Landis had experience with publishing Daily Declarations, his novel. So there was already kind of a team in place. We used the same audiobook narrator, the same cover designer, I think the same designer who did the layout, if I'm correct. So it's helpful to already have people who you vetted. Obviously, like if it's your first time self-publishing, it's probably going to be a longer lead up because you have to figure out how to do all that and who you want to work with. But with this, we were able to just kind of get it right out the door because there was already a team in place.
Yeah, that design is amazing. I love the design.
Thank you. We've got a good book designer and a good cover designer. Dissect Designs in the UK did the cover. Jennifer Tripp up in Rhode Island did the book design, and we're really pleased with what they.
What about the audio version of the book?
So yeah, that's Bill A. Jones. He's an actor in LA. He's also a crooner. He does sort of the Sinatra stuff that he sings, and he did the audiobook for Deadly Declaration. So he has done the audiobook for Death by Podcasting. I think he did a good job. Hey, let me mention one thing in response to your question, because a lot of times people think, authors think sometimes that until your book is traditionally published, you don't get that stamp of approval that this is good. But I heard a statistic recently that came out of this conference that of the top 100 books in Amazon in over like 30 categories over like from 2020 to 2023, in the mystery and thriller category, 47% of those were self-published books, and about 25% of them were traditionally published, and then the other were the small presses. And that just goes to show you that it doesn't the quality of a particular book is not determined by whether it's traditionally published or self-published. If you look at the top 100 that are selling on one of the biggest online networks, and also with that, they looked at the reviews, and the reviews fell in line whether it was indie published or traditionally published for those top 100 books. So it just goes to show that if you can do it right. I will say this, that traditionally published, I think, you can have a broader distribution if you're young, if you're just getting into it. But for those that are indie published and have done it for a while, you can get some pretty good distribution online. And you can also put the books out faster, which is what we wanted to do. We wanted to get this book out because it was fun. We were having a good time with it, and we wanted people to be able to read it.
Yeah. If it was up to me, I would self-publish everything. The issue is that you have to put a lot of money up front, and you probably won't get back your investment. If we do the math, it's like, if you want to pay for an editor, a book designer, and audience, like we're talking about maybe 10 grand. It's a lot of money for starving artists like myself.
Yeah. No, it is. There is an investment there, and I think that a lot of traditionally published authors don't really get into indie publishing and doing really well until they've gone the traditional route and have built up a little bit of a following, and then they find their readers and they can go from there. And I've never personally focused too much on how many readers there are. I'm just trying to get the book in as many hands as I can and hoping people are having fun with it. And I'm not really trying to keep score yet as to how many books I'm selling. I'm going by the mantra that the way to market this book is to write your next book, because the more books you have out there, then the better chances that people are going to find you. So
and go back and read. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that was a hard lesson for me to learn, because I stopped writing after the first book and I just focused on, I don't know what, but and then I realized I cannot market the book. I have to start writing. So that was a hard lesson. So okay, so I want to talk a bit about podcasting and being an author and a podcaster. Do you think every author should have a podcast, and what are the pros and cons? Like for me, I love it. And I was chatting with Sarah before we started recording, is it's a labor of love. I pay
Mhm.
out of my pocket just to run it, and mostly for these kind of conversations. This is what it means for me to run a podcast, is to have this community. But in terms of the building platform, and do you think every author should have a podcast? What do you think, Sarah?
Well, I wouldn't say every author should have a podcast. I think if it's something you're interested in, then go for it, give it a try. It's something like self-publishing where there's a pretty low initial barrier to entry. You can kind of make of it what you want. You can
Yeah.
put as much time and effort and money into it as you are willing to do. And, it's a lot of fun. We get to
A
meet
lot of
people like
fun.
you and we get to
Yeah.
talk to authors from all over the world. And I really enjoy it. And it is helpful for building a platform. But I think with anything that goes into sort of building your platform, your brand, your community as an author, or marketing your books, there's no thing that I would say, well, every author has to do this. You don't have to have a newsletter. You don't have to have a blog. You don't have to be on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. You don't have to have a podcast. You don't have to do in-person events. I think you have to do something if you want to reach an audience and get your books out there.
Yeah.
But you can kind of pick and choose and figure out what
Yeah.
different methods work best for you.
Yeah, I
So
want to pick up on that to say that two things. One, I agree with Sarah that you should only do a podcast if you are really going to be committed to doing it. We have a little epigraph in the front of the book here from the founder of the Queen City Podcast Network about a thing called pod fade. After most podcasts die after about 8 episodes, they just kind of
yeah.
go away, and they came up with a term. It's called pod fade. It's because people wear
Ah,
out, and
okay.
so the fact that you just stay with it is work. But in order to stay with it, you've got to really enjoy doing it, because as you said, Natasha, you're putting an outlay not only of your time but your money
Mm,
to make it work. And we have found that there are aspects of it that are very time consuming. I mean, the vetting and the responding to emails and the coordinating and getting the interview set up and making sure the technology works and all that kind of stuff. And yet it's kind of what I likened to back when I was an athlete in college. I never liked the practices, but I love the games. And it's just kind of the same way with podcasting. All the stuff that leads up to, I mean, I had a interview this morning. It got derailed yesterday because of technological difficulties, and I was told because of the author's schedule, had interviews all day long, we didn't know whether we could reschedule. The author was David Badalci, but he had,
oh wow.
he had said, "No, I want to fix this." So we got together this morning, and it was a great interview. We had a super conversation, and I came away thinking much differently than I was thinking about podcasting yesterday, about how great that is and how fun that was and what a great experience it was to have that interview, because of some of the things I learned and just how, open he was about his processes and what he did, as many books as he sold. So, there is that upside. And look, I think that if you're an author, it doesn't have to be podcasting. I mean, as Sarah said, find something that is just not buy my book, buy my book, buy my book.
Correct.
Find
Yeah.
something where, like, I can see over your shoulder and I can see your book sitting on the shelf there, Tasha,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when you interview people, they know you're an author, and sometime they're going to come back and read your book and talk about your book. And you're going to be getting out there because you're doing something with it doesn't have to be a podcast. It could be a YouTube channel. It doesn't have to be in a podcast interviewing authors either. It could be a podcast talking about your dogs or your cats, or maybe you've got something you're really obsessed about that you want to talk about on a podcast with a friend or by yourself. I mean, that would be a way to do it. Or you could just start a book club, or you could do something else creative where you're involving people in the literary community.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think is kind of fun about marketing as an author is it's very personal. When you're selling your writing, you're selling something that came from yourself and from a deep place in you, and that has to do with your personality. And when people latch onto an author and start to really appreciate his or her work, they want to know who that person is. They like to get to know you on a personal level. So whether it's through the posts that you're putting up on social media or writing in a blog or a podcast or a YouTube channel, whatever it might be, you can tap into, it doesn't have to be just about your book and your writing. It can be about other interests you have. It can be about your personality. It can be about, like Landis says your dog, something that lets people kind of get to know you as a person.
Yeah.
I mean, we did this newsletter and we put pictures of us and doing different things. I put some pictures in of my grandson and myself because I'm very proud of my 2-year-old grandson, and we have a lot of fun together. So, it's also personalizing, as Sarah said, what you're doing that are going to maybe cause people to give either your podcast or your book or just something about what you're doing a first look.
Yeah. So do you do this full time, or do you have other, side gigs going on? Or, I'm just curious because you put a lot of time on it. And from my interaction as well with Landis 2 years ago, I mean, he's like very detail oriented, extremely professional, and it's
Sarah will tell you that, yeah. It's not a full-time gig. We don't punch a time clock, but
okay.
So, and Sarah's involved in a lot of things. I'm involved in a lot of things. What are your thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it's not full time. I think podcasting is kind of something that you can make it as time consuming or not as you are willing to make it.
Okay.
For us, I mean, we both have our own writing projects. Sometimes I do teaching or speaking gigs too. So I have other things too. And I've had other jobs in the past alongside that as well. I think we probably are at like the upper end of the spectrum in terms of how much time and effort we put into it compared to other podcasters. I mean, we release an episode every week. We have a newsletter. We have 9 books that we published with the podcast over the past year, and we've done events and workshops and conferences associated with those. So we put a lot into it. But some people release on a less regular or less frequent schedule, or they might not do like the newsletter, the social media, all the kind of stuff that goes alongside it. So you can kind of make of it what you will.
And like co-writing, we decided to sort of do co-podcasting. I know, Natasha, you do these interviews, and I did them by myself for the first 300 interviews. And after a while, I realized I'm not going to be able to do all these other things and get an episode out every week. So with 2 other co-podcasters, we can kind of split up the interviews, and that way we can get as much content. And also it's nice, I think, that people get to, because we all 3 of us have a little different interview style, just like we all have a little bit different writing style. And it's nice, I think, for our guests, our listeners, to be able to hear from Sarah and Hannah and me in different formats.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you monetize your podcast, if you do, or if that's something that you want to do?
Well, I'll tell you, when I first started the podcast, I had this idea that, I'm going to try to monetize. And, the first a year or 2, I got some sponsors. And honestly, I'm a retired trial lawyer. I'm fortunate to be in that position. I started realizing it was taking me more time, and I started figuring out what my time was worth to go get these sponsorships, that I would rather take I still do a little work as an arbitrator, a year. I might have 1 or 2 arbitrations a year. I just take some money I make from the arbitration work and stick it in my podcast account and don't worry about it. It's like one of those things that, everybody's told us, well, Landis, y'all could probably really monetize this, and they're probably right. And Sarah and Hannah, I may get around to it at some point, but Sarah's about to have a baby, and Hannah's going to be moving, and I've got some things to deal with. So eventually, maybe on our 10th anniversary, we'll start monetizing. I don't know, but it's not something we've been overly focused on because we've been able to keep the cost down. We only have so many costs, and we've got some Patreon supporters, and those Patreon supporters we really appreciate. We're able to help us cover some of our costs on the audio website and our regular website. So we're not spending a lot we could be spending more money on advertising and that kind of thing, which we used to do when I had a little sponsorship. We're just not doing as much of that. So we're trying to cover our cost through some of our Patreon supporters and the little bit of money that I stick in to the podcast account.
Do you do your own editing?
I do. I use a editing software called Hindenburg. So we kind of divide responsibilities. Sarah has been taking charge of the show notes and communications with the authors. I've been doing the audio editing, and Hannah has been doing the social media and the graphics.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah. It's a lot of
Yeah,
work,
it's a lot of
and
work
you're
by one person,
fortunate
right?
you have yeah. I do it. I mean, the only thing I outsource is the audio editing.
Yeah, yeah.
Just I couldn't do it. It's just a lot of time. And so, who are your audience? Do you have an idea of who come to your podcast? Which countries? Which regions are they? Mostly from North Carolina, because I think you highlight a lot of authors from the South, correct? And there's a
Yeah, originally it was just North Carolina because that's where we started. But when we expanded
yeah,
and started having authors in over 35 states and 4 or 5 countries, we started picking up listeners in different parts of the country. And I think our statistics show that it is spread out now. There's a concentration in the South because we're located in the South, but then we do have listeners from all over the U.S. And we're not killing it in downloads, but we're getting 3,000 to 6,000 downloads a month, something like that. And so it's we've got a nice little audience. We appreciate that regular listeners, and we sort of go by the mantra of it's better to have 1,000 people that are listening to you than 100,000 people that say they are but never are, kind of thing.
yeah, yeah.
I also think this was one of the kind of nice side effects of the pandemic in a way, because you used to land us record at a studio in person in Charlotte. That was actually when I was on as an author guest a few years ago. That was what we did. But then when you went to remote recording, it opened things up a lot, so we can have authors on from other states and other countries, and that's probably helped pick up listeners from other places as well.
Okay. And how do you find the guests? Do they come to you?
Well, originally we hunted them down, and we now we've got our website lets people submit, and then a lot of publicists found out about us, so our mailbox get inundated, from the big five with people that want to be on the podcast, or at least their publicists want them to be on the podcast, and then so we have to go through there and vet those out. Honestly, it's more than we can put on the podcast that we get, submissions from. So that's another reason I probably wouldn't want to run a small press, because I hate, saying no to people. But we did come up with a couple ways that people can be on the podcast without being interviewed. We have something called elevator pitches that people can do a 30-second elevator pitch. We got a link; they can do it on our website, and then we'll put it on the podcast. So.
Ah, wow. And what would make you pick the person that would go on your podcast? Like, why did you say yes to me when I pitched to you? I remember I think I did some research and like, what are the best podcasts for authors, and I think your name came up and I submitted. What makes you say yes to people who pitch?
I thought your book had an intriguing title, and you had a nice little pitch, that went along with it. And you're up in I'm trying to remember, were you in the Baltimore area?
Yeah, in Maryland, in Rockville,
Maryland?
near DC, yeah, in the suburbs of DC, yeah.
And also look to try to find people from different parts of the country and that kind of thing. And I think your book had an interesting heritage aspect to it, that you were dealing with, and that I had not explored before on the podcast. So I thought that would be interesting. So we look as much for what the book's about as to what the author can also share from their personal stories. So I thought, as you recall, we talked a little bit about your personal story on the podcast and and how you got there. So that was another reason Sarah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we certainly try to make space for people who we know personally or who have been on the show before or who are local authors. We want to make sure we represent them. But in terms of authors who we don't already know, it's kind of a combination of factors. We have the luxury, like Landa said, of saying no to people and of kind of picking and choosing. So between the 3 co-hosts, we can look at submissions that we get and say, like, is this a book that actually looks like something I want to read? That's a big factor, honestly. I think looking at the professionalism of the submission is important. So if you're submitting or having a publicist submit on your behalf, just making sure even the little things like, even if the book sounds intriguing based on the plot, if there are very, very obvious kind of grammatical errors or typos in the summary, that makes me think, how much time and effort did this person put into the book? or having blurbs from authors whose names I've heard, that can make a difference. I look at the person's bio. If there's something in their bio that makes me think, oh, that would be interesting to talk to the person about, then that's a good factor for me. Or if they have something about not just the book itself, but maybe their career as an author. Maybe they do something interesting, like having their own book podcast where they talk to other authors, or something they've done for marketing that sounds interesting. I think that could be something that we could talk about on the show. So I'm kind of looking at, is this a book that I want to read? Is it a genre that we cover, first of all, because we don't do as much in terms of like nonfiction or children's books. But also, what sorts of things could I pull from that might be interesting to talk to this person about?
And do they follow the directions in terms of how to submit? A lot of times people don't follow the directions. They'll shoot you an email instead of going to the submission page or something, and they'll fill out the wrong submission form, or the one that says feedback for the podcast instead of the one that is author submission. They're right next to each other. You can't miss it. But I do think Sarah really hit the nail on the head that it's those kind of different factors. And I mean, I like to read mysteries, thrillers. I might explain, Natasha, a little bit why your book intrigued me, and Hannah likes sort of the dark, suspenseful things. And Sarah, you can speak for yourself as to what you like.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm always a sucker for good literary fiction or anything kind of speculative or magical realism. I love anything with humor in it. So I think between the three of us, we're able to get a good variety on the show.
So your book was started with the podcaster receiving a text message, which is, not really a death threat, but telling them that they're going to be murdered, right? So in terms of your feedback, have you ever received something threatening? Like what, or that was just a joke? Or what was kind of the worst feedback that you ever received? Have you ever upset an author? I want some juicy stuff.
That's interesting. I don't think we've had too much terrible feedback. There was without giving actual identifying details. There was a book that we profiled in a certain way on the show where we heard from a family member of the author who wrote into us to kind of complain about the book, which was interesting. But I think that was more about some drama within the family. Yeah. But I don't know, Landis, have you gotten any? Certainly no death threats, I hope.
No death threats. I did have one author one time wanted me to take down their photo because I didn't use the photo from the good side, so
was that a woman or a man? You're not gonna say. Okay.
We won't go there. But it was, we ended up putting in some things in place, like a little consent form you sign that just basically says, we have the right to use your photo or your bio, and people.
Because you're a lawyer. You have to go do all these consent forms. Like for me, I don't do any consent forms. Maybe I should. I'll probably get sued.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to use ours. It's on the website. You can download it, and it's. But yeah, different people do it different ways. But in terms of feedback on the podcast, everybody's been really good. Who has been on there? We've only had very rarely have we had people try to sort of control the narrative, but every now and then you'll have someone who's a little nervous and wants to kind of stick to a script, and you have to kind of help them loosen up a little bit, because you want it to be conversational and you don't want it to sound scripted. And that's more, I think, nerves on their part than anything else. They've got something they want to read, and you kind of pull them out and get them focused a little bit. I guess the feedback I've gotten that, everybody gets these 1-star reviews, right, on your books from time to time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, good reads.
I've enjoyed those when people didn't like my plot line. It wasn't about the book. Or they just didn't. I had one 1-star review on one of my holiday books that involved a global warming theme as part of the plot, and they didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that global warming might be a thing, and so they gave me a 1-star review and said, this Christmas book was definitely written so that Al Gore could read his read this book to his granddaughter at Christmas time.
Yeah, everything is about politics here.
This book is just as much of an inconvenient truth, or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well,
and those are fine. Those 1-star reviews, people can look at them and go, "Okay, I get it." It's, whatever. They're not really talking about the book. They got
or they trash the author. That's at least in Goodreads, it's famous for that.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just gonna nitpick on something here, which is your book started with this person sending a text message, not an email, and I kept thinking, as a podcaster, who sends podcaster text messages? One, and how did they get their phone number, and why didn't they use the other traditional way of contacting a podcaster, an Instagram DM, an email, or whatever? So that was just.
It's the investigative reporter coming out, huh? Yeah. Well, I guess, my contact information, including my mobile number, is part of my signature on my email, and it's also on the podcast.
Okay.
So
I see.
People can, I suppose that Raspy Fuse and Salty Remarks made the same mistake, and this person was able to get their text number and be able to text them. Yeah.
Do you get text messages?
I do every now and then. Well, the reason we do it is just so that if there's a technical glitch while we're trying to record, we can text the person and say, "Hey, are you ready? Where are you?" Oh yeah, I did have somebody I had to text one time, and they had overslept, and I think they'd been out drinking the night before too, because
he was really well prepared.
I'll be
prepared for the podcast.
I'll be right with you. And I thought, well, this person really loves our podcast. They're ready to go.
Yeah. Pre-gaming.
Yeah.
That's fun. So what are you working on next?
Well, I'm having a baby in February, so that's
congrats.
A big personal project. But in terms of writing, I've been writing a bunch of short stories lately and using that as an outlet to kind of explore, particularly more literary fiction, and just kind of try out different subjects and styles and voices, and publishing some of those in magazines and journals. I also do screenwriting, and I have a few scripts that are kind of in different stages of development, but I have one that I'm focusing on right now that's a feature based on a true historical story set in Germany during World War II. So I've been working on that, and I'm about to go into draft 3 of that one, I guess. And I have a couple of novel ideas that I've been making notes on and thinking about, and I'm not quite ready to jump into a draft on either of those, but definitely over the next year, that's a goal of mine, is to start kind of getting into one of those as well.
Sarah always has projects going, and she's being modest because she also just had a short story that's been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. So,
oh wow, congrats
to her on that. And as far
Where was it published? Was it published?
It's a British journal called Shooter Literary Magazine.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah. Oh, congrats. Yeah, and Landis?
Yeah, so in 2022, I had a book come out called Deadly Declarations. It was a historical mystery set here in Charlotte where 3 retirees find a man's body, and all of his notes about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence are missing when they find his body. And this is a little true story that very few people know about, that there was a Declaration of Independence before the Declaration of Independence, and it was signed in Charlotte, North Carolina, or so the story goes. And so they set out to try to solve the mystery of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence if they don't die trying. And that's set in Charlotte. And so this year I'm probably going to bring those retired characters back, and I'm going to work on the next novel in the series in 2024. And this one will probably involve the Gold Rush period in Charlotte, which was in the 1820s. And I think I'm going to find a body in the first chapter that is buried in a shaft, and there's a gold nugget in their pocket. And because, there's gold mines under all those bars and big tall buildings in uptown Charlotte, they're still there. So we'll see what happens.
Fun.
I'm excited for that. That sounds really cool.
So before we conclude, what are your tips for an author who wants to start a podcast?
Well, my first tip would be find an existing podcast and join that like I did. Because it makes it a lot easier if you have someone who already knows what they're doing. And knows
come join my podcast.
I got lucky.
Yeah. Can I join your podcast?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, seriously, actually, if you can collaborate with someone in some way, that might be a good idea. But I would say, make it your own. Think about what works for you. There's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of shows that interview authors. So think about how you can put a spin on it that feels authentic to you and that works for your conversational style. Podcasts can look very different from each other. They don't have to be any sort of length or format. So think outside the box and kind of find what sounds fun and interesting to you.
Yeah. And I would add to that start small and have a vision for what you want to do, but record at least 10 episodes before you release the first one. That is, go ahead and build up a body of work so that when you start releasing on whatever schedule you decide to release them on, whether it be once a month or once every 2 weeks or once a week, you've got a backlog there that you can work with, and you're not putting quite so much pressure on yourself. You don't want to be week to week or feel like you get to the end of the month and you got to have a podcast to stay on track. And also think about the fact that if you want to start a podcast, you could just create a one season podcast. You could actually just do a one topic or one focus. So you could get, 10 writer friends and focus on one thing and do that. And that could be it. And then you can bring it back another time. You don't have to be doing it every week or every month. You could do it seasonally and maybe take a break and then come back and do it again season later. And you could just add it to your author website. By the way, everybody who's listening, who's a writer, make sure you have an author website and keep it updated, because it's very important as far as brand building and that kind of thing. But I just think not trying to be like, there are too many podcasts out there, right? There's too much competition. Don't feel like you got to meet the competition. Find your own unique voice and what you want to do with it. And don't feel like you got to be like everybody else. And have a good time doing it. That's the important thing. If you're not having a good time doing it, it's not worth doing.
Yeah, I agree. For me, it's the good time. That's the reason. So, how can people find your book and Death by Podcasting? How can they get in touch with you? How can they submit to your podcast? All of that, if you can let us know.
Well, Death by Podcasting it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically anywhere you like to look for your books, you can find it. There's also an audiobook version that's available, and that's going to be uploading to more platforms as well shortly. So paperback, ebook, audiobook, you can find it through any of those. You can go to charlottereaderspodcast.com and learn more about that book or about our quote book series. And from there, you can also sign up to our newsletter or submit to be interviewed or submit an elevator pitch or submit to our blog or contact us. There's a lot of different ways to get in touch through there or find us through social media. Yeah.
And I think Sarah's website is saraharcherwrites.com and I'm landiswade.com. Very creative. We use our names and, that's our websites. And she said at the Charlotte Readers Podcast website, there are tabs across the top. In the far right, there's a contact tab. And on there, it has places where you can submit or you can put your elevator pitch on there, or you can write a blog post that we'll post on our community blog. There are all kinds of ways that writers can engage that aren't necessarily being interviewed on the podcast. But yeah, you can find this book anywhere. It's not very, look, it's only $2.99 on the online sites, and it's only $9.99 in print. And we tried to put it somewhere in the middle of that for the audiobook. So we're trying to make it very affordable. It's not like we're making much money off it. We just want to have a good time with it and hope that people who've ever heard of, you don't have to be on a podcast to do a podcast. You don't even have to like podcasts, but if you ever heard of a podcast, this might be the book for you.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really fun, and I'm humbled to have big podcasters and authors on my podcast. And for anyone who's watching or listening, thank you for joining us for another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. And until we meet again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you for tuning in to Read and Write with Natasha. I'm your host, Natasha Tynes. If today's episode inspired you in any way, please take the time to review the podcast. Remember to subscribe and share this podcast with fellow book lovers. Until next time, happy reading, happy writing.